It's January 15th, 1919. You're standing on Commercial Street in Boston's North End, a narrow working-class neighborhood pressed between the waterfront and the elevated railway. The air is unusually warm for mid-January, almost spring-like, and the children around you are playing in the streets during their lunch break. Behind you, looming 5 stories tall, is a massive steel tank, 50 feet high, 90 feet in diameter, filled to near capacity with 2.5 million gallons of crude molasses. You've walked past it 1,000 times. The neighborhood kids sometimes press pennies against its riveted walls to catch the slow leaks of sweetness that seep through. The tank groans. It has always groaned. You've learned not to notice. But today, at 12:40 in the afternoon, the groaning stops, replaced by a sound like machine gun fire as the rivets shear from the steel in rapid succession. And then the wall of the tank simply opens, and the world turns black and thick and incomprehensibly fast. To understand how 2.5 million gallons of molasses came to be stored in the heart of a densely populated neighborhood, you have to understand the economics of industrial-era Boston and the particular alchemy of molasses itself. Molasses was not merely a sweetener. It was an industrial product of enormous strategic value. Distilled, it became ethyl alcohol, the base ingredient for munitions. And in the final years of the First World War, the demand for munitions was insatiable. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol, had constructed the massive holding tank on Commercial Street in 1915 specifically to receive shipments of crude molasses arriving by tanker from the Caribbean. From there, the molasses would be piped to the company's distillery in East Cambridge. The tank was a way station in a chain of profit that stretched from sugarcane plantations to the trenches of Europe. The tank had been a problem from the very beginning. It leaked, not subtly, visibly. Molasses seeped through the joints and rivets so persistently that the company had the tank painted brown to disguise the streaks. Residents of the North End complained. Workers at the nearby public works stable, where city horses were housed, noticed the walls weeping. According to later testimony, the tank's own overseer, Arthur Gell, a man with no engineering background who had been appointed treasurer of Purity, distilling largely through family connections, had been warned repeatedly that the structure was unsound. Gell had supervised its construction despite having no formal training in structural engineering. He never consulted an engineer. He never ordered a water test, the standard practice for verifying a tank's integrity. He simply had it filled with molasses and hoped for the best. For nearly 4 years, the tank held. It groaned and leaked and swayed, but it held. Then came January 15th, 1919. The previous day had been bitterly cold. Overnight temperatures had hovered around 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But on the morning of the 15th, a warm front moved in and temperatures climbed rapidly, rising nearly 40 degrees in the span of hours. Inside the tank, a fresh shipment of molasses from Puerto Rico, delivered just days earlier, had been fermenting. The fermentation produced carbon dioxide. The warming air expanded the gas. Pressure built against walls that had never been strong enough. At approximately 12:40 in the afternoon, the tank ruptured. The failure was not gradual. It was catastrophic and nearly instantaneous. The rivets blew out in a cascading line. Witnesses later described the sound as gunfire, and the steel plates peeled apart like the skin of a fruit. A wall of molasses, estimated at 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, surged into the streets of the North End. 35 miles per hour. This was not the slow, proverbial ooze that the phrase slow as molasses might suggest. This was a wave with the momentum of thousands of tons of liquid moving through narrow streets with nowhere to disperse. The physics were devastating. Molasses is denser and heavier than water. The wave carried with it shattered steel, splintered wood, paving stones, and everything else it encountered. The destruction was immediate and total within a radius of several blocks. The Boston Elevated Railway's support columns buckled. A section of the elevated track, with a train due to pass over it within minutes, was shoved off its foundation. The city's public works building was demolished. The firehouse on Commercial Street was torn from its foundations and shoved into the harbor. Freight cars were swept from the railroad tracks. Horses in the public works stable, animals weighing over 1,000 pounds, were knocked down and drowned where they stood. And there were people in the streets. Bridget Clufferty, a woman in her 60s, was in her home on Commercial Street when the wave struck. Her house was lifted from its foundation and crushed. She was killed. Her son Martin survived, pulled from the wreckage hours later, coated in molasses and barely breathing. Pasquale Iantosca, a 10-year-old boy, had been collecting firewood near the tank with his sister. He was swept away and killed. His sister survived. Flaminio Gallerani, a driver for the Public Works Department, was found dead in the wreckage of the stable, his body so encased in molasses and debris that rescuers initially could not distinguish him from the dead horses around him. 21 people died. 150 were injured. Many of the dead were not found for days. Some were not identified for weeks. The rescue effort was grueling and surreal. Sailors from the training ship USS Nantucket, docked nearby at the playground pier, were among the first responders, wading into the knee-deep molasses to pull survivors free. Boston police, Red Cross nurses, and ordinary residents of the North End joined them. But the molasses was not merely an obstacle, it was a trap. It clung to everything. It hardened in the cold air. Victims who were still alive could not move, could not breathe, could not cry for help through mouths and noses clogged with the thick, dark syrup. Rescuers described the sound of muffled screaming beneath the surface of the flood. The cleanup took weeks. In some areas, the molasses was 4 feet deep. Workers used salt water pumped from the harbor, sand, and eventually sawdust to try to absorb the residue. The brown stain spread through the city. Residents tracked it on their shoes into subway cars, into homes, into hospitals. For months, the harbor itself ran brown. The legal aftermath was as significant as the disaster itself. More than 100 lawsuits were filed against United States Industrial Alcohol. The company's defense was audacious. They claimed the tank had been destroyed by a bomb planted by anarchists. It was 1919. The Red Scare was gathering force. Italian immigrants, the primary residents of the North End, were widely associated in the public mind with radical politics. The company bet that prejudice would do the work that evidence could not. It did not. The case was heard by a special auditor, Hugh W. Ogden, a distinguished Massachusetts attorney. Over the course of nearly 5 years, Ogden heard testimony from over 900 witnesses and reviewed thousands of documents. His investigation was exhaustive and methodical. In 1925, he delivered his finding. The tank had failed because of structural inadequacy. It had been poorly designed, poorly built, and never properly tested. United States Industrial Alcohol was responsible. The company was ordered to pay approximately $628,000 in damages, roughly equivalent to $11 million today. The anarchist defense was rejected entirely. The Great Molasses Flood occupies an unusual place in American memory. It is sometimes treated as a curiosity, a bizarre, almost comic disaster, the kind of event that appears in trivia columns and odd history listicles. But there was nothing comic about it. 21 people died in agony, drowned and crushed by an industrial product stored carelessly in their neighborhood because their neighborhood was poor, because they were largely immigrants, and because the company that built the tank believed that cutting costs mattered more than cutting risks. The Ogden Report's conclusions helped establish a legal precedent that would shape American industrial regulation for decades. Corporations could be held liable for negligent construction. Engineers would increasingly be required to certify structural plans and sign off on public safety. The disaster did not single-handedly create modern building codes, but it became one of the early, terrible lessons that wrote them. Today, more than a century later, a small plaque on Commercial Street marks the site where the tank once stood. The neighborhood has changed beyond recognition. The waterfront is condominiums and parks now, but on warm days, some residents of the North End still say, and whether this is memory, legend, or something in between, that you can catch the faint smell of molasses rising from the ground.